Hi, I'm Alicia Longwell. I'm the Louis B. and Dorothy Cullman Chief Curator here, and I'll look less crazy if I can get this mask off my earring. Whoa. There we go. It's wonderful to see you all. I can't really remember the last time we had a sort of noontime series on a show. Had to be pre-COVID. It's going to be a benchmark in all our lives for a long time, I'm sure. But back again. My great pleasure always to speak on when we have a big, important show like this, especially wonderful to be able to, for me, and I hope for you, to be able to delve into some of the stories behind some of the works, some of the life of the artist, and etc. And this work greets you as you come in. It's sort of signals the, it's not the earliest work in the show, but it is indeed a very important one, and it sort of signals this moment. Now, I have seen people running through the galleries, and if you did this, it's okay. I don't mean running, but going saying, where are the dots? I know when you hear Roy Lichtenstein, you think dots, right? The big, wonderful cartoon paintings and cartoon-based paintings, and why not? He became justifiably world-renowned. The artist David Sally once said that if a Roy Lichtenstein painting fell out of a plane at 20,000 feet and landed almost anywhere, people would instantly recognize his extraordinary style and joie de vivre and everything about his work. This exhibition, and I hope if you haven't seen it, that's fine. You can go to the galleries later, of course, and if you have, you know it's a very focused period from 1948 to 1960. Now, I'm sure, I mean, oftentimes we think artists, you know, they sort of come full-blown with that first signature world-known style. Well, obviously they don't. Obviously there are a lot of steps through, most often through schooling, looking at other artists, travel, many things that influence artists, and all these things go into the mix. And the interesting thing about this exhibition and every work in it is that it's right on the cusp, you might say, of that moment that we will come to call pop art. It wasn't Lichtenstein's term, but something critics usually give these terms to art movements, so pop art. And really right on the cusp, or with some of the works in the large gallery, the final gallery chronologically, some of the works there are from 1960 and 61, and the important part is that the first painting he did that became known as pop, and you might say arguably the first pop painting by any artist, although there were quite a few others, is Look Mickey. So Look Mickey, there's a small blow-up of it on one of the labels in that room, but Look Mickey is when he first really took cartoon, in this case sort of a little golden book. He had two young sons, and the boys kept saying, why don't you draw something we know or like? So he took this image, and that is where we get to in this exhibition. And what we see is the lead up to that, what influenced him, how he got there, because it's all in the moment of each and every painting, really, that he did. 48 sort of begins when he finishes graduate school and begins to teach. But let me start with this. This is a self-portrait from 1951. It's, I don't know, when you first see it, you kind of don't know exactly what to make of it. Where does some of the ideas come from? At this point, he is, as I said, finished with graduate school. He's teaching, he's on his own, and he's living still in Columbus, Ohio, where he went to school, both graduate and undergraduate and graduate, and he's painting this painting. I would think if we looked at a few, you know, art historians love to see things that look like other things in things, right? So if you just look at all the things about this painting that are not, you might say, like a great deal of other artists' self-portraits. But let's go back to Roy. He doesn't have a palette in his hand, which is often an attribute in self-portrait of a painter. He does have a painting on the easel, but frankly, it looks kind of like what? Doesn't look like a cartoon or any later work. It looks more like a sort of green landscape, maybe, right? In truth, it probably was a landscape. Lower right is a landscape painting that he did in the 1940s, but it's not something we associate with Lichtenstein. So let's look for more clues in here to maybe what he was to become. He was, or what he was looking at then. His paintings of that are really homages to Chinese landscape painting come very much later in his career with dots. So he was very knowledgeable about this painting and loved it very much. Top right in the painting is what is probably a stained glass window. There were a lot of those in houses in the Midwest, influenced by someone named, Helen, you know this, Frank Lloyd Wright, the great architect, who almost always had a love to include these windows. That's a design of his upper right to show you the idea. So could have been the house he lived in, could have been stained glass that he saw, but certainly interested in that as a geometric element to put in the painting. Let's look at that hand. As you see in many, many Renaissance portraits, this is a portrait by Bronzino on the right. There's a fabulous show, as I'm sure many of you know, in New York now about this incredible painter and others. But Bronzino, you know, everything is in the hands, and that's what you go to almost in those portraits. And I think Lichtenstein is really making a reference to that. He loved historical paintings. On the left is Sofonisba Anguillola, and she too has famous woman artist of the Italian Renaissance period, whom we've heard more about in recent years than in the previous 300. But these beautiful pictures of her, how she depicts her hands, just the creativity that you feel is innate in what she's doing. In the Bronzino also, the hands, he's on a book, and you might assume that this young man is very learned, very studious, very romantic. All these things you learn, we don't learn so much from Lichtenstein's depiction here, but it's hard not to see that this sort of ham-fisted hand, you might say, it's not particularly expressive. It's getting the job done. He seems to be holding maybe a piece of paper or maybe even a rag that he might work on the surface. But, you know, sort of couldn't help but think of Mickey, frankly. Always with the gloved hand. You know, mice don't really have hands. So Uncle Walt had to give him, you know, these anthropomorphic attributes. And his hand is always kind of this hand like this, like a mouse hand, but wearing gloves, so you know he is capable of many, many things. But this depiction Lichtenstein uses for his hand is so sort of distilled, and it's really, he's not here bragging about his expressive hands, his creative hands, his hands imbued with great ideas to paint. He's just sort of painting a hand. Now, this is all my interpretation of this work, and certainly open to any, this may suggest a million other things to you, and I'd love to hear it too. Upper left is a folk art head, also known that he was a great, I don't know, collector, but looked at folk art, loved it very much. That sort of expression, which is and the expression on his face has been called like mannequin-like or something, but I think it's much more related really to that wonderful spirit of folk art, where the artists were, we come to now think of them as very skilled in how they depicted. It's not a Michelangelo head, let's face it, but with this incredible liveliness and beauty to that folk art head. So I would suggest that all these things are things that Lichtenstein looked at, undergraduate, graduate, as a young man, and maybe we'll just go back, catch up on some of those when he was a young man. I did put in a few other pictures of artists, often depicted with palettes, often depicted in various other states of concentration or painting, or you certainly can't miss the Picasso self-portrait from 1906, which Picasso at that point was, the whole school of Paris was what you were learning in academic situations. He would have known probably everything to know about Picasso. And again, this mask-like face on Picasso, again, sort of a ham-fisted hand there. The other one holds a palette. Also, looking at him sort of distilling this thing it is to be an artist, it's often, this is at the same time, of course, he was collecting and depicting African masks. So another sort of paring down of features, not unlike the folk artist, to have that very sort of stylized features. On the left, that's, of course, the great Paul Cézanne. He just needed to. There are no apples in that picture, but he doesn't need for us to see what he's painting. He was a consummate art, a huge of the 19th century, what influenced the 20th century. But let's look at Roy, if I may call him that, because I'm going to run out of breath saying Lichtenstein. He's age 11 here. He apparently on a vacation in the upstate. Born and raised in New York City, grew up on the Upper West Side. His father was a successful real estate dealer. He dealt mostly with garages and loft spaces and that kind of industrial space, the father. So he was born in 1923, and as I said, into a comfortable background, although they had somewhat moved to smaller quarters, you might say, during the Depression. But coming out of that, we're on a solid middle class, or upper middle class, you might say, background, so much so that Roy was sent to a private school. But they were on the Upper West Side. The Metropolitan Museum was like a playground for kids. I mean, I've heard so many artists of that age and Upper East Side kids too, but that, your parents thought nothing of you just going at 8, 9, 10, just go to the Met and get lost in the Egyptian galleries. I know Richard Avedon always talked about that. It was just something at a time in New York where you felt perfectly safe and that they'd be just fine if they went to the museum by themselves. So he was, again, this term omnivore comes in my mind. He was looking at everything, absorbing everything. And there's no question he would have seen at some point this painting, which looks like a couple of 11-year-old kids there as well. This is a huge painting. Anybody know what it is in the Met? That's right. It's, of course, just the way Washington crossed the Delaware. The three men in the front are pushing the icebergs. The general is improbably standing erect in a tiny rowboat on this perilous crossing, and the flag is raised. It has all the attributes of a very patriotic painting. Now, fact of the matter is it was painted by the artist named William Leutze, who was of German. I think he was born in Germany. He'd been in America. He was back in Germany and wanted to paint for all the sort of German provinces that were not very united at that point. He wanted to create a great American painting that showed how coming together and democracy and all these things was worth pursuing. The date of this portrait is just about 100 years after the actual incident. So it has that layer of looking back. Now, what's interesting, and this gets a little ahead of ourselves, Roy comes back to this subject as well. I better say Lichtenstein. It sounds a little disrespectful. Was an amazing person. I did know him towards the end of his life. But anyway, so I'm just thinking that this, as a visual experience, was huge at that point. I guess it was a little still before Cinerama, but to know this work and see it more than once, I'm sure. So there he is, upper left. As I said, the family sent him to a private boys' school on the Upper West Side, the Franklin School, where he did very well. He was disappointed. He'd been let's just say he'd been drawing from childhood. He loved to draw. He was disappointed they didn't have any real art classes. His mother saw to it that he enrolled in what I would assume would be Saturday classes at the New York School of Arts, which was to become Parsons, and also in the middle you see the Art Students League. Now, you may have heard about the Art Students League. It was a big practicing, one of the main art schools in New York. I mean, everybody went there for a time. The teachers were well-known New York artists. On the right is Reginald Marsh. Lichtenstein didn't, mature and paint anything like Reginald Marsh, but the fact of the matter was that he was a serious, well-known sort of New York regional painter. All those wonderful scenes of, women in their sort of blousy hair and dresses crossing 14th Street, that whole school, that whole sort of Union Square idea of the vitality of New York. So at this young age, he was really, you might say, in the mix. He was knew about. There probably would have been, brushing elbows with other established artists in New York at that time. But that's what he was doing. Now, when it came time to graduate, that is a graduation picture on the left, in 1940. He knew he decided he didn't want to go to an art school. In other words, a one that the pedagogy focused primarily on art. He said he wanted to maybe get out of New York. He looked around, and Ohio State University in Columbus had a very active art department, fine art, drawing, engineering, drawing, sort of a broad spectrum of what you might call art. He was very attracted to that, and as he said, he kind of wanted to maybe put a little distance between himself and, where he'd grown up, let's say. So to that end, he did matriculate at Ohio State. So we're up to 1940 now. He took a painting class with someone named Hoyt Sherman. And I'll get back to Hoyt Sherman in a minute, but one thing, it was a painting class, it was an oil class. It's not what Hoyt Sherman is remembered for today, but Lichtenstein studied with him. That's how he got to know him. And like many teachers, I mean, they taught a lot about the 20th century, and it was Picasso, maybe a little Matisse, maybe some Miro. We'll throw in some El Lissitzky there, but Picasso was it. This is what you studied, you looked at. On the left is, of course, that famous portrait of Gertrude Stein, about the same period as Picasso's self-portrait. Again, that sort of mask-like visage, looking at the African masks that the French artists were all buying and putting in their studios and looking at. And on the right is a painting from 1943, which I love, that Lichtenstein did, sort of after Picasso. It's, I think they discovered sort of this in doing research for this exhibition. They discovered this sort of hidden in the files. I don't think the painting is still extant, but you can see what he's looking at. Again, go to the hands. It's so interesting to me how the depiction of hands is like right after the face. Obviously, it's the flesh that's showing, but how important they are in these portraits. You may remember that after the painting was done, and Stein and Picasso were very good friends, and she declared, "It doesn't look like me," and Picasso's retort was, of course, "It will." Has to be one of the great lines. Who knows if that exchange really happened, but it sort of sums up both sides. Stein's not going to be terribly grateful for this portrait that he did of her, despite his great talent. So I kind of love that Lichtenstein takes up this almost, this sort of challenge. I'm going to copy the Gertrude Stein. Let's see what's next. So I mentioned Hoyt Sherman. This, you know what? I have a couple of quotes here that I wanted to. Sherman was actually at one point hired by the U.S. Army to work with pilots. This is now, the war is on. This is after Pearl Harbor. The feeling that pilots, once you see a plane in your vision, you're done. That if you're up in the air in a fighter plane, you're the target there. You don't have a chance to shoot first, so to speak. So the idea was to develop not only a peripheral vision, but to seeing the whole and not seeing the parts. This also comes up in Gestalt psychology, of which I know not much, so correct me if I go down a rabbit hole that's not right. But Sherman had these ideas. The whole Gestalt psychology was the whole branch of it was a Danish really phenomenologist named Reubens, who began to study this, and it was really all about boiling it down to something it's a little easier to understand. It was about visual perception. It was how you saw the world. Did you focus in on one thing, or did you get sort of the big picture, we might say? So Hoyt came up with this exercise, and although he was an enormous influence on Lichtenstein, and Lichtenstein saw this, as he called it the Flash Lab, Hoyt named it. That's a picture of it in the middle there. He was never actually in those classes. He observed it, and what Sherman did was to take, that's another sort of diagram on the right, and when the Flash Lab got bigger and bigger because everyone wanted to study it, it was a way of seeing and drawing. So what happened was he would project an image on, to the front of the classroom. There you see everyone doing it. The room was blacked out totally. We could actually probably do a flash lab right here today if we wanted. But absolutely dark in the room. Suddenly projected on this screen was a bright light and showing various patterns. Now on the left are some of those slides, which you see one has like upper left has one bar. It gets more complicated. It gets more complicated as you go on. But anyway, one slide was projected for 3-4 seconds. So in this dark room, in the blinding light, you see it for 4 seconds, then it goes off the screen, and you are, the task is to draw what you saw. And as you can see, the progression of the slides there, it gets more and more complicated as to what you might retain. The idea is not to focus on one dash or one circle, but to get an image of the whole thing. Reuben made up this, and you've probably seen it. It's like the ultimate parlor trick, right? It's called Reubens Vase. They're yellow, and you see a yellow vase, right? See the yellow vase? Now, if you look at the other vase next to it, you don't, what do you see? Two faces, two profiles, and which is interesting to show you. That's also, it's a lot about figure and ground. In a painting, you talk about, background, what's in the ground, the bottom layer, and then figures which might come on it. But this idea of what comes up, what's figure and ground. Now, I couldn't possibly get any more in the weeds than I am, so I'm getting right out. Enough is to say, like Lichtenstein, I was never really in the Flash Lab, but it was these ideas that he heard and that really influenced him. And I just wanted to, you might recognize this Reubens Vase by another masterful artist of the 20th century. I'll put in a plug. You may know John's reached his 90th birthday. Many tributes were held. It fell in the middle of the pandemic, and the big show at MoMA and the Philadelphia Museum had been delayed, although it's there now. And we will have in April, late April, May of this year, incredible survey of prints. I mean, it's not really a survey, it's the entire print oeuvre of John's. It was collected at the Walker Art Institute in Minneapolis, and it will be extraordinary. It will have over, almost 200 prints and be the complete cycle of his prints. And he was an extraordinarily important printmaker, as has been pointed out in the two shows at MoMA and Philadelphia. It was not an ancillary pursuit or in any way lesser than his paintings. So this is a couple on the right are two Johns. The lithograph at the bottom he actually called Reubens Vase, and otherwise that same figure ground relationship in the vase will turn up, as this figure throughout his work. So that was the. I just want to read what Lichtenstein said about the Flash Lab. The ideas of Professor Hoyt Sherman on perception were my earliest important influence and still affect my ideas of visual unity. He taught me how to go about learning how to look at what doesn't have anything to do with it. It is a process. It has nothing to do with the external form the painting takes. It has to do with a way of building a unified pattern of seeing. So, very interesting in the sense of what he goes on to do with the dots. The dots are, I'm trying to say that the dots are not visible yet, but they're coming in a way. I think when he talks about this unified pattern of seeing, it's almost like this, the Ben-Day dots that came, which were based on the technology of the printing. Obviously, those little dots just make up the picture. So in a way, it's almost like, he's going there, in a way, almost. So he, being that Pearl Harbor had happened, the war was on, he was drafted. He was private in the Army. He was sort of in the intelligence. He apparently in France at one point was a mile from the front. his parents, he was a little sheepish because he would write home and he would just say, please send me some more paints. And they said, where are you? What's going on? Where's the war? And he would always say, well, I'm fine. I'm fine. But please send me some more oil paint or ink to do my drawings. Oh, yes, he was stationed in Texas and in Mississippi. He was at the Army Entrance Camp Shelby in Mississippi. Throughout his training, he wrote to his parents a series of brief letters revealing an artist with an acerbic sense of humor who was much more interested in art than war. And he goes on to talk, this is in August 44, but first I want to point out that this, speaking of a wry outlook, the cartoonist upper left, that's what he is. He's in the Army too, but he's a main cartoonist for the Stars and Stripes, Bill Malden, and very, very famous for the things he was doing, which were printed every week in the Stars and Stripes, which is the official Army newspaper, which went all over the world, wherever soldiers were serving. This is a rather arcane cartoon. Apparently, I don't even understand. It has levels of referring to George Patton, his old Blood and Guts, and he sent somebody off on a mission, a 1,000-mile detour. Anyway, suffice it to say that in Mississippi, Lichtenstein's commanding officer had Lichtenstein draw. The officer loved the cartoon so much he wanted like blow-ups to put on his office walls. So Lichtenstein was assigned to make these big drawings and copy these cartoons so that his commanding officer could hang them in his office there in Mississippi. You can't make this stuff up, right? It's very funny. Here is what he writes home from Camp Shelby. Since I was in my senior year, here. Dear folks, we are now parked in, and he had to leave school. He had another quarter to do with his undergraduate, but had been drafted. All right. Dear folks, he writes from Mississippi, we are now parked in one of Mississippi's most exclusive swamps. But the commanding officer knew the head mosquito, so we were allowed in. The rugged terrain offers very good subject matter for drawing, and I've done many. Of course, it's a little hard to see through the mosquitoes, but I just have some private blaze a trail through them. Speaking of drawing, could you get me some charcoal sticks, soft, willow, brand name, preferably Rouget, but Weber or anything else will do. I use up the stuff like mad. Have fun, love, Roy. Of course, he wasn't in the European theater at that point, and he certainly did get very close to the combat action. But just to show you what was really on his mind, he was sort of the end. He had an assignment the war was ending, to be in Paris. You see him there at the Eiffel Tower. His first taste of a really big European city with some time to do, he was able to take a course at in French in the language, sort of a tail end of the war, and some GIs were staying, of course, in France, enrolling under the GI Bill, which they could do. He did stay there for a bit. He wrote home that these were some of his favorite paintings that he saw in the Louvre. The great El Greco, the Cézanne, one of the card players, and that's a Daumier, the laundress, la blanchisseuse, and they're just, again, just an omnivore, not any one particular period, any one particular artist. This spans, hundreds of years of art making, but he just absorbed everything that he saw. So this brings us up to about 1947, 48. He's back in Columbus. He's decided to He had that, after the war, he had that one sort of semester to finish because he'd been drafted. He finished that up. He decided to stay there for graduate school. He already began to teach undergraduate and was painting some of the works you saw in the first room here, the first exhibition gallery, working and, maybe picked up Life magazine or saw it at the barber shop, and what greets him? This. Is he the greatest living painter in the United States? Well, probably for all intents and purposes he was. But Lichtenstein, like a bunch of other young artists like Klaus Oldenburg or Larry Rivers, or, when you pick this up and you go, wow, is that the greatest? Is that what's going to carry the day? And of course it was absolutely true about Pollock, and he was on the crest of a wave, which he rode for a long time. Abstract expressionism reigned. There was nothing probably of less interest to those younger artists for themselves. I mean, they were, of course, interested in what art was shown in museums or selling. That might be another point. Realized that Lichtenstein, the lifelong New Yorker, is still in the, I don't want to say the boondocks, but he's in the Midwest. And that's a whole other, that will play a lot into his sort of feelings when we break through next week to the next type of paintings. But he's in the Midwest. It's a different place from New York. He's teaching in Columbus. He soon after that moves to Cleveland, still teaching, and has begun to sell some work there. He is married to a young woman who is in the interior decorating business, and it's said that there no table legs were safe when Roy was around, because if he saw a spare when this is King on a Horse, one of the wonderful pieces in the show. And there he is at a studio that he had set up in Cleveland. You see, something I didn't talk about much is this whole sort of whimsical idea that underlies much, particularly in these sort of folk art pieces, the sculptures which you see. Whimsy, irony. For some reason, the first time I wrote anything about Lichtenstein, down about maybe a wall label or something, I came up with the term wry. I didn't come up with it. Just that sort of smile that you saw in the very half smile or a quarter of a smile in the self-portrait, just sort of a wry outlook on wry, which can mean randy, but in this case, just sort of that bemused expression in looking at the world, He's seeing it in a totality, and is, I think, many times often bemused by what he sees. This is a wonderful, also in the first gallery, are quite a few paintings and also pastels, a beautiful group of pastels, which he did in one period and didn't much do after that. You can see that he's really sort of paring down what you might choose to depict. It's called the pilot. He's also looking at archetypes in a way. He's doing a picture of the pilot, and there's the cook, and there's the diver in those images. So he's looking at things that communicate what these figures are, and yet it's very much in a shorthand way of describing them. You don't get great insights into the pilot's head here, right? He's in a plane and he's steering it, but not quite sure what's going on. He also, speaking of whimsy, speaking of wry, this is his self-portrait on the left from 51 as the knight, which I love. I don't know what dragon he's going to slay, but he needs to get that one gimlet eye going. I don't know what this knight could save anyone from. But again, you think of the knight slaying the dragon, and in the end, what's the knight going to get? Because he rescued her. The damsel. That's the word, the damsel. So despite his kind of flat-footed, and I don't know what is quite going on there with his leg warmers, but he's on his way. It also reminds me of that little 11-year-old picture when he was 11, right, going. He's a man who certainly could take himself not seriously at a point, he could be amused at himself, which I think always is a redeeming virtue in some people. Not all the time, but you should be able to see your own foibles as a way. Anyway, this is the knight, and I know what everybody's thinking, like, what was he thinking? And, it's really he didn't write volumes about some artists do. He didn't write volumes about his work. He was, could be, but when he was succinct, as I read that quote, what he mentioned about Sherman's teaching and how it helped him with this visual perception. I think it's been suggested, medieval architecture influenced him, but I would have to say that it's not all that far between the knight here. And in truth, it's only about 10, 15 years when you'd be full-blown into rescuing damsels again. Or this is a typology if there ever was one. I don't care. I'd rather sink than call Brad for help. So what do you know? Brad is just, forget it, Brad is not a nice guy. And this is actually, you can trace it to some previous, something that was drawn. I mean, in the sense that Lichtenstein took from everybody. Of course, same thing with Picasso. He said, I steal from everyone, blame me. But this is the same thing. I mean, it's that looking at the world and sort of taking into your perception what you need almost. And, the picture on the right tells a whole story with an economy of lines and very few words. But this is, I couldn't resist the sort of thinking about the work across just a few more years. I mean, not a long time. As I say, by the time we get to the end, in talk number 3, we will be right on the cusp of pop art now. Who was he looking at? On the left is a work by a Swiss artist named Paul Klee, absolutely extraordinary artist. The color, the, what do you call that lower right in that image? It's a stick figure, basically, Again, the trees, they're just sort of schematic trees. On the right is the diver, another archetype that Lichtenstein looked at in that sense. It's been pointed out that this was just when Jacques Cousteau was beginning to do his undersea explorations in a big way. And maybe that's true. It seems quite plausible. But just this, there were a lot more knights and a lot more kings in this period, the sort of medieval. And I see Lichtenstein just sort of painting his way through this, not maybe knowing where he was going exactly. I don't think artists in the first 10 to, I mean, again, this is the period right out of school. So this is still a lot of experimentation, a lot of exploration, a lot of different ideas. But what you have to do is do it, keep at it. Of course, he was teaching, but he was painting, every day in that sense. I'm going to just bring this sort of right up to the next talk, not necessarily as a tease, but just to say this is where we are by the time we get to the next gallery called the Curators, who organized the exhibition. And I'm remiss, I didn't say that this is an exhibition organized by the Colby College Museum of Art in Waterville, Maine, and the Nasher Museum in Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, by actually Beth Finch at the Colby and Marshall Price at the Nasher, who happened to be classmates of mine in graduate school. And each of them had a early Roy Lichtenstein painting in their collection. And at some point, this is after, of course, we're all out of graduate school, we're all, running into each other and talking about things, and apparently both of them had begun to look at this work, and the early work, and kind of like a head scratcher. Where did that come from? This is the first major exhibition organized of this early work, so it's, there've been and the museum has shown a retrospective, prints from the National Gallery's big show, so we have done quite a bit with Lichtenstein. He is, of course, our hometown boy. He and his wife Dorothy moved here in the 70s to Southampton, lived here full-time for quite a few years, and then always kept this as a home base. Had a great deal of affection, as Dorothy still does, of course, we're glad to know, for this institution, and their generosity, as you will see, in the Lichtenstein Theater has been game-changing and profound. And the legacy of this artist, we just thought, what a wonderful thing to be able to present. In fact, someone else was hatching this idea of doing an early Lichtenstein show, and that happened to be the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation. He was a prolific artist, much work sold over the years, much work was kept, a lot of this early work was kept, and also the director of the foundation, Jack Cowart, a wonderful art historian for many years, decided he would kind of put out feelers, and things might come up at random auction sales, and they would say Roy Lichtenstein, if they would be an early piece, he would give things away to neighbors in Columbus, and there was a lot of stuff in the Midwest that he'd sort of given away. And there is a wonderful self-portrait in the first gallery that you should see. It's kind of dead ahead, just a small ink drawing, but it says inscribed to his friend, and then and this is in 1949, so it gives you a little insight into how he was thinking about himself as an artist. He said, "Here to my friend so-and-so, hold on to this, I'm going to be famous." So I think artists are trained and educated, but you have to be born with that sort of idea. This is what I want to do, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to be famous. So I would just close in sort of looking at what's ahead next week, this idea of mythic America and what it means, and very much about this post-war period. Remember, he's in the Midwest. The suburbs are, people are fleeing the cities, the suburbs are growing. Midwest also, as Native Americans were pushed westward, we sometimes think of just the West in the context of that, but of course, on the push westward, there were many tribes in the Midwest, of course, and he was very influenced by looking at the artifacts, by looking at some of the remains of those earlier settlers, and so this idea of the Native American or Indians comes up in his work. So that will be all next week. And looking again back to the Leutze, which was flat out propaganda. And no two ways about it. And then the paintings from a year later, which were, what am I saying, a year, a century later, almost to the day, Lichtenstein's version of Washington crossing the Delaware. So I'll leave you with that.